will be probably an hour and 15 or 20 minutes, and have some questions. If you get tired and you want to leave or use the restroom, you're not going to offend me. Next, we have what are called the nuns. These may be people with no religion. I'm spiritual but not religious. In the United States, this is the fastest growing group. In fact, there are more of the non-religious in the United States than all of the mainline Protestants combined. So if you add up your Lutherans and your Episcopalians and your Methodists and your Presbyterians, they're a smaller group than this fast-rising no-religion group. Next, we have Buddhists, about 6% of the world's population. Various folk tribal religions. You might see Aborigines in Australia, South America, and tribal religions in Africa, about 6%. Taoism, largely in China, is about just under 6%. Then you have Sikhism, which you see the Sikhs predominantly in India, somewhat of an offshoot out of Hinduism. And finally, as important as it is for the Judeo-Christian tradition, Judaism is a very small 0.2% of the world's population. Again, when we want to look at religion in terms of how old these faiths are, it's very interesting and a little somewhat humbling, as well as for me being someone raised in a Christian environment, how relatively young Christianity is in the scheme of world religions. So when we look at this, we start out Hinduism is actually the world's oldest religion, currently surviving. These are currently surviving traditions. Judaism, Zoroastrianism, you still have, I think I've seen the statistic, maybe 160,000 Zoroastrianisms in Iran. It's an ancient Persian religion. Then Buddhism, Jainism and Buddhism came about 500 years before Christ. Taoism in China, Sikhism in India. Then we get down to Christianity and Islam, are kind of the two most recent of the world's religions. So the first question I want to pose today is, why is it so important what you guys are doing here? Why should we be having this interfaith dialogue? Here in the United States, I think for many people, what got crystallized was at 9/11. It really brought this idea of fundamentalism and other traditions home in a very real way for a lot of Americans that hadn't really thought much about these other different traditions. But as someone who's kind of grown up in the South, I've seen a lot of different aspects of my own background in Christianity in a way that can also be very exclusionary. I use a term sometimes that I call country club Christianity. And what I mean by this is this sense that our religions can be, in primitive environments, a religion can be your tribal identity. In a society like the United States, our religion can be a place that we belong, almost like an exclusive club. And it may be a particular church, it may be a particular denomination in which we define ourselves. And what is it people like about being in clubs? It's the part that I'm kind of in the know and that you're not. Or in other words, we get this sense sometimes of I'm saved and you're not. And we see this not just among, well, Christians are saved and Jews or Muslims or Hindus are going to hell, but it's my particular type of Christianity. We're the only ones that have it right. And these Baptists or these Catholics, they have it wrong. They're going to hell. So we keep kind of dividing these things up. And the importance of interfaith dialogue is to start to break down those barriers. Here's a fun cartoon that I found a while ago. This mother comes into her daughter and says, those Hindus down the street are heathens because they have more than one God. So let's say a prayer for them. And the daughter says, okay, should I pray to God the Father or God the Son, or God the Virgin Mary, or my guardian angel, or one of the saints? So we're going to get into some of these subtleties in these different faiths later in my talk and start seeing how some of these lines start blurring a little bit. There's another cartoon, aliens orbiting over an exploding Earth saying, as near as I can tell, they're fighting over which religion is the most peaceful. So when I start to break down this question of the importance of interfaith dialogue, I can think of three really important reasons why what you're doing here is so critical. First of all, interfaith dialogue, having this discussion among people of different faiths, breeds understanding and respect. So much of the conflict that we see around the world and within our own country of faith against faith is because we fear what we do not understand. We fear what we do not understand. And by having these kinds of events that you're having tonight, and the more we can promote these, the more familiar we can make various traditions. It doesn't mean that you have to agree necessarily with the other person's views, their practices, but it does mean that you can come to understand and respect them. Come on in, grab a seat anywhere. We're relaxed here. Number two, the more, and as a student of world religions, this has been very impactful on me. The more I started studying other different faith traditions, the more I started seeing the influences among various faiths and the commonalities as well. Religions do not come up in a vacuum. A religion all of a sudden doesn't just burst forth without a specific cultural and historical and sociological context. There is no way to understand Christianity without having some background and basis in Judaism, because Jesus, his 12 disciples, the Apostle Paul, their earliest followers, were all Jews. When they talk about in the New Testament, when you read and they mention Scripture, and Jesus or Paul talk about Scripture, they're not talking about the New Testament because it hadn't been written yet. They're talking about the Hebrew Scripture, or what Christians would call the Old Testament. Understanding Buddhism is impossible without understanding Hinduism. Is a name of actually the British coined for the Indian religions when they became kind of the colonial rulers over India. But the Hinduism or the Brahmin religions of the Buddha's day, it's hard to understand Buddhism without understanding Hinduism. Islam, as we'll see in a few minutes, it cannot also be understood without seeing a background of Judaism and Christianity, out of which this Abrahamic tradition evolves as well. In terms of commonalities, we're going to talk more about some of the common different themes among the world's religions, but if we just think, for example, the moral teachings. In Sunday school classes, children also often get taught the golden rule that gets attributed to Jesus. Well, actually, Jesus is merely restating an ancient Jewish moral teaching in the book of Leviticus. If we turn to the Quran, if we turn to the Vedic scriptures of Hinduism, of the Pali-Buddhist canon, we find this exact same golden rule teaching of do unto others as you would like to be done to you, almost word for word in every one of the major faith traditions. So the more we study, the more we can start seeing these interconnections that these different faiths have. And I think that also breeds more understanding and respect. Personally, what I find most fulfilling, though, about the interfaith dialogue process is that maybe, just maybe, by having a dialogue and learning about philosophy, spiritual practice, a bit of history from another faith, it might shed a new light on our own traditions. As A.L. mentioned in my background, that what always gets the most interest for people is the fact that my wife and I were competitive ballroom dancers for over a decade, traveling around the country and the world competing. And what was interesting to me as a student of dance was that we had our main coach in Atlanta, who was one of the top coaches in the country. We learned so much. But occasionally we would get other coaches that would come through. Those of you that might be fans of Dancing with the Stars, Louis Van Amstel, one of the early pros from that, would come to Atlanta and we would get coaching from Louis. And he would say something that would be a little bit different, or from a different angle than our current coach was. And it would always add something new to our dancing that we would learn in a deeper way by experiencing these other teachings. And what I found through my travels to India, through practicing yoga, through practicing meditation in Bhutan, through dialogues with some different Sufis, my own Christian tradition I see in a vastly different light than I did when I was younger, 20 years ago. When I started my kind of interfaith journey, one of the early other non-Christian texts I picked up was the Tao, Tao Te Ching, written about 6 centuries before Jesus in China. And I came across this passage. In the beginning was the Tao. All things issue from it. All things return to it. Every being in the universe is an expression of the Tao. The Tao gives birth to all beings, nourishes them, and maintains them. This is a very powerful, it spoke to me for some reason, because immediately what I did is I just substituted the word God for Tao in this. But then, as I started reading this, there was a familiarity to this saying, this passage that was 2,600 years old. And then it struck me, and I opened my New Testament to the prologue to the Gospel of John. And I read this. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him. And without him, not one thing came into being. And the more I started exploring these various texts, the more I started seeing these fascinating philosophical parallels. But before we get into specific faiths, one question that often comes up is, if there is an ultimate truth, if there's something beyond our everyday realities, why don't we just have one tradition? Why is there not just one religion in the world? Why do we have to have all of these dialogues in the first place? So let's spend a few minutes and talk about some of the theories behind why we've got so many religions in the first place. And we're going to look at a number of different these.